August had cleared the way for a change in the course of the war in Vietnam. On April 3rd, some 60 hours after the President's Sunday evening address, Radio Hanoi issued a 1,000-word broadcast of its own. It was confident, boastful, and bristling with the usual hardline cliches. But buried in the rhetoric was one significant paragraph, and that paragraph electrified the free world and gave the United States its first real diplomatic breakthrough of the war. Hanoi, it said, was ready to meet with United States representatives to discuss the cessation of U.S. bombing raids and all other acts of war. Perhaps the sudden willingness of the North Vietnamese to talk was a tactical maneuver, a probe costing them nothing. Perhaps it was a test of settlement terms, or simply a counter-move to avoid losing a propaganda round. Whatever it was, the potential for ending the long diplomatic stalemate was suddenly there. After an intensive round of consultations with some of his closest advisors, President Johnson made a prompt and affirmative reply.
Accordingly, we will establish contact with the representatives of North Vietnam. Consultations with the government of South Vietnam and our other allies are now taking place.
Despite the crucial mid-morning activity surrounding the Hanoi broadcast, President Johnson took time to honor a prior request by Senator Robert Kennedy that the two men meet to discuss problems of national unity. This meeting, the last that they would ever hold, took an hour. Among the items discussed was the Hanoi proposal. 2 months and 3 days later, while seeking the nomination of his party for the presidency, Senator Kennedy would die at the hands of an assassin in the city of Los Angeles. Following the meeting with Senator Kennedy, President Johnson held a second hour-long session in the Cabinet Room. This one with Vice President Hubert Humphrey, just back from a diplomatic mission to Mexico City.
Once again, the heart of America is heavy for a tragedy that denies the very meaning of our land. The life of a man who symbolized the freedom and faith of America has been taken. But it is the fiber and the fabric of the republic that's being tested. And no words of mine can fill the void of the eloquent voice that has been stilled. But this I do believe deeply. The dream of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has not died with him. Men who are white, men who are black, must and will now join together, as never in the past, to let all the forces of divisiveness know that America shall not be ruled by the bullet, but only by the ballot of free and of just men.
By Friday evening, the first of over 11,000 regular Army and National Guard troops that would occupy the capital city until mid-month had taken up positions in and around the riot area.
and master man's basic problem, how to live in peace.
On Saturday the 6th, General William Westmoreland, commander of the U.S. forces in Southeast Asia, arrived at the White House for 2 days of talks with President Johnson. On their agenda were discussions on the progress of the war in South Vietnam, the selection of military advisors to accompany the American delegation to the talks with the North Vietnamese, and the appointment of his successor after General Westmoreland assumed his new position as Army Chief of Staff. By far the most significant news out of Vietnam during the general's stay was the word about Operation Pegasus. As suddenly as it had begun, the siege of Khe Sanh was over. On April 5th, the combined drive by U.S. and South Vietnamese forces had cleared Highway 9 and opened the major ground supply route to the embattled Marines, who had held it for over 76 days. On Monday of the following week, President Johnson received an official message from Hanoi, repeating in formal terms its previous statement agreeing to meet with American diplomatic representatives. Coincidentally, the president had already made arrangements for an evening flight to Camp David, where he planned to conduct a broad review of the war in Vietnam. Early the following morning, Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker arrived from South Vietnam. He had been joined on the last leg of his journey to Camp David by Secretary of State Rusk, Secretary of Defense Clifford, and General Earl Wheeler, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In his original reply to the Hanoi broadcast, President Johnson had proposed Geneva as a meeting site for the negotiating teams, and stated that Ambassador Averell Harriman was immediately available as the U.S. representative for initial contacts. The agreement to meet could develop into a settlement, but the chance also carried with it a risk that couldn't be ignored. If the talks failed to bring an acceptable accommodation, the war could rage even more fiercely than before. So the immediate problem for the United States and its allies was to be sure that the site for talks was mutually acceptable to both sides, and that we were dealing from a position of strength. President Johnson asked Ambassador Bunker for his personal evaluation of the progress of the war in Vietnam.
If Tet was psychological and political success abroad, it certainly was a resounding military defeat for them in Vietnam. The Vietnamese forces, for example, many of them were only at half strength. They inflicted very heavy casualties and drove the communists from every city in the country. The government did not collapse, but turned to with great will and determination. The armed forces did not defect. The people, after the initial shock, emerged strengthened in their anger and their hatred for communists and their determination to resist.
And Mrs. Clough, we welcome you to the beautiful Washington Spring, Mr. Chancellor, at a time of turbulence and hope in our nation. As it is for us here in America, so it is around the world. There is turbulence today in America and in Eastern Europe and in Southeast Asia. And there is hope as well in all of those places. So our aim at this season is to sift the hope from the turbulence, so hope may grow unfettered. Mr. Chancellor, the experience of your nation tells us that it can. you give us additional cause to believe that hope can coexist with turbulence, and that freedom and order will, in time, prevail. We expect this spring day in Washington that this will happen in our country, in America, and that it will happen in Southeast Asia, and will happen where every man of goodwill earnestly seek and pursue peace and equity and justice for all.
Even while President Johnson challenged, word came from Capitol Hill that Congress had passed and sent to the White House the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Included in the measure was a landmark open housing bill, which, when fully effective, would bid discrimination in approximately 80% of all housing offered for rent or for sale in the United States.
I do not exaggerate when I say that the proudest moments of my presidency have been times such as this, when I have signed into law the promises of a century. I shall never forget that it is more than 100 years ago when Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. But it was a proclamation. It was not a fact. And in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we affirmed through law that men equal under God are also equal when they seek a job, when they go to get a meal in a restaurant, or when they seek lodging for the night in any state in the Union. And now the Negro families no longer suffer the humiliation of being turned away because of their race. In the Civil Rights Act of 1965, we affirmed through law for every citizen in this land the most basic right of democracy, the right of a citizen to vote in an election in his country. In the 5 states where the act had its greater impact, Negro voter registration has already more than doubled. Now with this bill, the voice of justice speaks again. It proclaims that fair housing for all human beings who live in this country is now a part of the American way of life. We all know that the roots of injustice run deep, but violence cannot redress a solitary wrong or remedy a single unfairness. And we just must put our shoulders together and put a stop to both. The time is here. Action must be now.